A Bloodbath in the Border Princes, Part 6. Dangerous Gambits. The warlord of Festerspike was not pleased. At their feet, a skaven slave begged for their life after delivering the news of the recent skaven defeat. "Useless minion! Rip tear I will when I see them." To punctuate their point, the warlord smacked their staff into the slave on the floor, who simply cowered under the assault. Slightly winded by the exertion, the warlord stopped and motioned for their guards to remove the slave and to throw them into the feeding pits. It was never wise to cause bad news in Skaven society. It was infinitely worse so to be the one to bear it. The warlord sat down on their throne and pondered. Their minion had failed to acquire additional resources, and their alliance with some humans had gone sour. That was of no matter to the warlord, but the deeper problem of resources remained. Festerspike was still recovering from their recent attacks by goblins, and they would surely be bled dry without new resources. The warlord was grumbling to themselves when their guards gave a cry of alarm. A tiny rat had rushed past their watch and scurried into the throne room. The warlord, relieved that the rat was not a bomb in disguise, and, of course, annoyed by their guards' failures, saw that the rat carried a tiny note tied to its back. With some curiosity, the warlord untied the message and began to read it. At that, his mood began to turn. Perhaps there was something to be salvaged of this mess, after all. Skitterspit rolled his eyes when the slave rushed up to him with new orders from the warlord of Festerspike. "Kill slay the halfmen?" he asked to no one in particular. Skitterspit and his gaggle of soldiers were marching along the Underway, a vast network of tunnels that the Skaven used to connect the Under Empire. Although he would have to pay tolls to the local warlords, this was the fastest way for him and his forces to attack these so-called half-men. Half of what? Skitterspit did not know, but there was a sizable bounty for the work. He eyed his troops. Their attack with the Chaos Warriors had been unsuccessful, and morale was beginning to flag. These half-men seemed like an easier target, one more suited to Skitterspit's preferred methods of war. As they marched, he eyed the long barrels and nervous glances of his Jezzails. A fiendish plan was beginning to germinate in Skitterspit's mind. Merry Bramblepatch was in a melancholic mood. This was not the grand adventure he had hoped it would have been. Instead of heroic action and plentiful rewards, the halflings had battled starvation and annihilation at the hands of all sorts of monsters. They had endured suspicion and mistrust from the locals, once even being banished from a town. While the company had struggled to survive, their quest to recover the lost homes grew ever more distant. Merry sat and perched in a tree, writing in his journal and overlooking their camp. Experience had taught them not to linger too close to human towns, and yet fear had kept them from venturing too deep into the woods. Right now, many of their company were seeking temporary employment in the nearby town, and this had kept their company afloat. The Border Princes were a dangerous land, and no one wanted to hire halflings with a reputation for being beaten. As per usual, Merry saw Barnabas sauntering about camp, his spear in one hand and a pie in the other. Unlike Merry, Barnabas seemed entirely carefree, despite almost losing his life some time ago. A knock, a staff against wood, rose Merry from his sadness, and he looked down to see the smiling face of Gregory. The old man seemed strangely chipper. "Master Merry, what's the matter, dear boy? Why do you look so glum?" At first, Merry seemed hesitant to answer. "It's not an adventure, grandfather. We failed the moot, and we failed you. Some heroes we turned out to be." His grandfather sighed and nodded knowingly, resting his hands upon his staff. "Merry, we've not failed yet. Setbacks at most. Listen, dear boy. A wizard cannot so easily be fooled, and a halfling not so easily waylaid. These are dangerous lands, lad, but never underestimate the tenacity of our people." The kindness in the elder wizard softened Merry's sadness, so he continued. "Made for battle we are not, which is why I've entreated with the services of a mercenary captain. Find your brother and make ready to leave. We'll be traveling with the Compagnia del Corvo." "Enough!" A pistol was fired into the air, stopping some of the armored men from their brawl. Magnus shouted at the assembled men in the lists. They were tired and sweaty, and their armor was caked in mud, but they stood to attention, eyes firmly fixed on Magnus, and of course, the pouches of gold on the table nearby. Captain Koenigsmark had his pistol in the air, the barrel still smoking. Ernesto, Magnus's manservant, sat at the table, making careful notes of the trials unfolding before them. The Compagnia del Corvo had seen an uptick in business after successfully battling an orc army down south. Such was the influx of work that Magnus had taken a contract to bring the company up north, escorting a merchant. Normally dangerous work, the company had arrived in Eckendorf without incident, to the disappointment of some and to the relief of others. The merchants had brought with them fine dwarf-made armaments, and the local garrison was much improved thanks to this delivery. This earned the company further fame, and thus their present situation. Magnus had intended to bolster the ranks, and made it known in Eckendorf that he would be paying decent gold for fine horsemen. He, Ernesto, and Captain Koenigsmark had spent the better part of a day whittling down potential applicants from the town's freelancers and lesser nobles. Ernesto kept the records, and Koenigsmark assessed the riders. He had also enforced order when the fight had broken out. The final two groups, Bretonnians and freelancers from the Empire, had started a brawl when the Bretonnian captain accused the Empire captain of cheating during the joust. With the brawl halted and order restored, Magnus deferred to Ernesto regarding the final choice. The Bretonnians were better horsemen, for sure, but the freelancers came equipped with far better armor. Ernesto thought for a moment, and then pointed to the Imperial Knights. Magnus, trusting in his judgment, dismissed the Bretonnians and started the process to sign up the new heavy cavalry. The freelancer captain, Reinhard Grimson, seemed particularly happy to see the Bretonnians dismissed. Magnus merely smiled at the man, quietly lamenting the cost to repair their now battered armor. Prelude to battle. Mary looked out over the water from the deck of one of the great barges that made up their convoy. The flight of the halflings had been dire, but they had arrived at the meeting spot as indicated by Gregory. Awaiting them was an assortment of armored men with all manner of weapons, the Compagnia del Corvo. Gregory had sent a message to the company's leader, Magnus von Ravensburg, and somehow convinced the mercenary to allow the halflings to come along as the mercenaries escorted a large shipment of goods down to Parak Far. Such was the reputation of the mercenaries that they took residence on several massive barges as they moved along the river to Parak Far. Mary saw soldiers of all types, even cavalry, and for the first time felt truly safe. At present, the convoy had halted for the day. Night travel, even on a river, was always perilous, and thus they had to stop in the late afternoon to make camp. Many of the riders had disembarked with their horses on the nearby bank to allow the animals to feed and to recover from river travel. Mary was taken completely by surprise then, when a firearm's crack split the air and he was shot by an unknown assailant. At first, normalcy reigned in the camp, an accidental discharge, perhaps, but when Barnabas came running to Gregory, the rest of the camp had been alerted. A sniper had shot Mary, and the wounded halfling was taken below deck for safety. Magnus quickly roused his cavalry, and at the urging of Gregory, sent them in pursuit of the attacker, while he made ready to follow suit with the rest of the army. They would catch them, if only because their unseen assailants were careless with their planning. Magnus had not expected to find a host of rat-men in that forest clearing, but his light cavalry had done the job of harassing the skaven until the rest of his army could have been brought south to the attack. A small force of soldiers and the halfling company had been left back to defend the boats. The rat-men, surprised by the attack, and also confused, arranged themselves into a battle line with their vaunted Giselles in the middle, and the other units to guard them. The mercenaries formed their own line, light cavalry on the flanks, with their other soldiers marching in formations close to the enemy. The mercenaries formed their own line, light cavalry on the flanks, with their other soldiers in marching formations to close with the enemies. The humans had the initiative and moved their light cavalry up first to skirmish with the enemy, while their formations of pikemen and halberdiers began to move forward. Screened as they were by the daring Captain Koenigsmark and the light cavalry, the soldiers suffered little fire as they maneuvered into position. The heavy cavalry, under the newly recruited Captain Grimson, however, proved far more impetuous and prepared their own charge. Crossbow bolts and pistol shot held up the Skaven left flank, while Grimson's lancers made several charges into the center, their heavy armor protecting them from most of these Skaven attacks. A volley from the Giselles, however, caused them to panic, and they wheeled around to fall back. Magnus, seeing the gap in the line, brought forward his own heavy foot to plug that gap. The slower-moving halberdiers and pikemen continued to move up the right flank, but the skaven on that side seemed hesitant to engage them. The mercenary arquebusiers, however, were now in range, and fired their own volleys back at the ratmen, causing some minor wounds and increasing the chaos of the battle. The battle was decided, however, when Magnus and his dismounted men-at-arms were able to crash through the center and slam into the Giselles. The ratmen, not used to such close battles, panicked and fled, and the warlord issued a general retreat in order to preserve the army. With night falling quickly, the skaven retreated into the dark to lick their wounds, while Magnus and the company retained control of the field. The skaven had suffered heavy damage to 2 units, whereas no unit in the mercenary army was damaged enough to leave lasting effects. The sudden attack on the halflings had been avenged, although the skaven leader had escaped to fight again.